me not see it.
I never really questioned why my family looked different. You grow up seeing the same faces in photo albums and you just accept it as your normal. In every portrait on my mother's side, there is this striking, almost unsettling trait. Everyone has one standard brown eye, but the other is a pale, clouded violet. It looks like a storm trapped in a marble. We always called it the guest's window. My grandmother used to pat my cheek and tell me that we were never truly alone, and as a kid, I thought that was comforting. I thought it meant we had guardian angels or something sweet like that. I didn't realize it was a warning about a squatter. The first time I felt this shift was a few months ago. I was driving back from a late shift, the kind where the highway is just a black ribbon cutting through nothingness. The dashboard lights were the only thing keeping me awake. I was tired, the kind of exhaustion that makes your bones feel like leaden weights, but I was focused on the road. Out of nowhere, a massive buck leapt from the tree-line. It was a split second. I should have hit it. My brain hadn't even processed the tan blur of its fur before my left hand, the one resting loosely on the wheel, suddenly snapped. It wasn't a flinch. It was a violent, precise jerk of the steering wheel that sent the car veering onto the shoulder, missing the deer by less than an inch. I didn't move that hand. I felt the muscles in my forearm tighten and cord under someone else's command. I sat there in the silence of the breakdown lane, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Then I heard it. It wasn't a sound from the speakers or the woods. It was a dry, rattling chuckle that vibrated right behind my left temple. It sounded like someone dragging a stick over sun-bleached bones. "Not tonight, little bird," a voice whispered. It was thick and raspy, like an old woman who had spent 80 years screaming into a gale. "I'm not done with this body yet." I stared into the rearview mirror. My brown eye was wide with pure, raw terror, the pupil blown out. But the violet eye, it was calm. It looked focused, almost predatory. I drove the rest of the way home in a state of total paralysis, my hands barely gripping the wheel because I was terrified of what they might do if I let my guard down. Since that night, the guest hasn't been quiet. It started with small things. I'd wake up in the morning and find my fingernails caked with dark, damp earth, even though I hadn't stepped outside. I'd find things moved around the house, knives from the kitchen drawer lined up on the floor of my bedroom, all pointing toward my pillow. The violet eye started to feel different, too. It felt cold, like there was a piece of ice wedged into my skull. When I looked through it, the world didn't look like the world anymore. The colors were drained, replaced by shades of gray and bruised purple, and I could see shapes moving in the corners of rooms that weren't there when I looked with my brown eye. Last week, the physical changes became impossible to ignore. I was brushing my teeth when I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my jaw. I spat into the sink, expecting a bit of pink from my gums, but what came out was a thick, dark glob of something that looked like rotting meat. I leaned in close to the mirror and opened my mouth. There was a tear in the back of my throat, a jagged rip that looked like it had been made from the inside out. I could see something pale and wet pulsing in the gap. The smell hit me then. It wasn't just the metallic tang of blood, it was the overwhelming, cloying stench of a butcher shop left without power in the height of summer. It was the scent of deep, organic decay, something sweet and sickly that seemed to coat the back of my tongue. I tried to scream, but my jaw locked tight. I watched in the mirror as my left hand rose up, completely against my will. My fingers reached into my mouth, digging into the wound in my throat. I felt my own skin tear, the sound like wet paper ripping, but I couldn't feel the pain. The guest was blocking it, holding my nervous system hostage. My fingers pulled out a long, thin strand of something that looked like gray nerves, and I watched as my hand fed it back into the violet eye. The eye seemed to drink it in. The clouded purple grew brighter, more vivid. I was weeping from my brown eye, the tears hot and salty, while the violet side remained perfectly dry and staring. I decided I had to end it. I couldn't live as a vessel for whatever this thing was. I went to the basement and found an old toolkit. My plan was simple and horrific. I was going to take the violet eye out. If it was a window, I was going to shatter it. I sat on the cold concrete floor, a sharp wood chisel in my hand. I gripped the handle, my knuckles white, and positioned the tip at the edge of my left socket. "Do it," I hissed, my voice shaking. "Get out of me." I braced myself and shoved. But the moment the metal touched my skin, my entire left side went rigid. My arm didn't just stop, it reversed. The chisel was ripped from my hand and tossed across the room with a force that dented the drywall. Then, my left leg kicked out, knocking me flat onto my back. I lay there, gasping, as my own body began to crawl toward the dark corner of the basement. I wasn't the one moving my limbs. I felt like a passenger in a suit of meat that was being piloted by a monster. My head snapped to the side, forcing me to look into the darkness near the water heater. With my brown eye, I saw nothing but shadows. But through the violet eye, I saw her. She was crouched there, a spindly, translucent figure with skin like wet parchment. She was connected to me by hundreds of shimmering, bloody threads that ran from her fingers directly into my left side. She looked up, and she had the same violet eyes, dozens of them, stitched all over her face and chest. She began to pull the threads. My left hand reached out and grabbed a jagged piece of glass from a broken light bulb on the floor. I watched, a silent observer in my own skull, as she guided my hand to my right arm. The glass moved with agonizing slowness, pressing into the soft skin of my inner elbow. I felt the pressure, the sharp sting as the surface broke, and then the warm, viscous flow of blood. It wasn't a quick cut. She wanted me to feel the slow separation of the flesh. The glass sliced through the muscle, a rhythmic, sawing motion that made a sound like boots crunching through deep mud. I tried to fight, to tingle my muscles, to do anything to stop the slow carving of my own limb. But the more I struggled, the more the guest laughed. The sound was inside my ears, under my skin, vibrating in my teeth. She used my left hand to dig into the open wound, her fingers exploring the raw, red interior of my arm. She pulled out a vein, twisting it around my finger like a ring. "You are such a beautiful house," she whispered through my own lips. But it nodding off. "It's time to renovate." I'm writing this now with my right hand, the only part of me I still seem to have some control over, though it's getting harder. My left side is almost entirely numb, or rather, it belongs to her now. I can feel her settling in, stretching out within my ribs, pushing my lungs aside to make room for herself. The violet eye is no longer clouded. It is clear, bright, and hungry. I looked in the mirror one last time before coming here. The violet is spreading. Tiny purple veins are creeping across the bridge of my nose, heading straight for my brown eye. I can see the world through her perspective more and more, the way the walls of my house are actually covered in a thin layer of pulsing, black mold, and how the shadows in the hallway have teeth. I know what happens next. I've seen the old photos. My mother, my grandmother, my aunts, they weren't just born with that eye. They were taken over, one by one, until the person who started in that body was nothing more than a ghost trapped behind a violet pane of glass. If you see me on the street, and I seem a little stiff, or if I'm staring at you with an intensity that makes your skin crawl, look at my eyes. If they're both violet, it's already too late. And please, if I ask you to come over for dinner, don't come. She's looking for a new guest's window, and she thinks you have a lovely home.
Next story.
My dad used to do this thing when I was a kid that scared the hell out of me, though I didn't realize how messed up it was until I got older. He was a quiet guy, a mechanic who spent most of his life covered in grease and soot, but every now and then, he'd just change. Usually, it happened when he was exhausted or if someone really pushed his buttons. He would stop mid-sentence, his eyes would kind of roll back just enough to show the whites, and he'd start speaking this rhythmic, guttural sequence of sounds. It wasn't gibberish. It had structure, tone, and a terrifying weight to it. He called it the guest's tongue. He told me it was a gift, a way for the old ones to keep their breath warm inside our lungs. He died in his sleep a few years ago, and for a long time, I thought that weird family quirk died with him. But lately, things have started shifting in my own head. I've been working double shifts at the warehouse, pushing myself until my vision gets blurry and my brain feels like it's floating in a jar. That's when the guest starts flipping through the pages. It feels like there is a massive, ancient presence sitting in the very back of my skull. It isn't a ghost or a spirit, it feels more like a physical object, something dense and cold, like a stone monolith buried in the soft tissue of my brain. A few weeks ago, I woke up in the middle of the night and realized the room was vibrating. It took me a second to understand that the sound was coming from me. I was talking in my sleep, but the sounds were sharp and jagged, like rocks grinding together in a deep well. I reached for my phone and hit record. I sat there in the dark, listening to my own voice produce sounds that a human throat shouldn't be able to make comfortably. It sounded like a mix of clicks, deep humming, and vowels that felt like they were being dragged through gravel. The next morning, I took the recording to the local university. I found a professor in the linguistics department, a guy who looked like he hadn't seen the sun in a decade. I told him I'd found the audio on an old cassette and wanted to know if it was a real language. He put on his headphones, hit play, and within 10 seconds, the blood drained out of his face. He actually had to lean against his desk to keep from falling over. He asked me where I'd found it, his voice cracking. He told me it was a dialect of a Proto-Indo-European language that vanished thousands of years ago, something that predated almost every written record we have. He said it was impossible for someone to speak it today because the phonetic nuances required a specific type of oral tradition that has been dead for millennia. I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't tell him that while I'm sitting in my living room, I can feel something behind my eyes translating my every thought into that dead, freezing language. When I got home that day, the feeling got worse. It was a suffocating pressure, like a thick veil being draped over my consciousness. I went to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face, and when I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize the person looking back. My pupils were blown out so wide that my eyes looked like two holes punched into a void. I tried to say help, but what came out was a long, melodic string of those jagged sounds. My jaw unhinged further than it ever had before, and I felt a sharp, searing pain in the joints of my face. I walked into the kitchen, my movements feeling stiff and mechanical, like I was a puppet being operated by someone who didn't quite understand how joints worked. I found myself standing over the sink, staring at a pack of raw chicken I'd left out to thaw. Without a single conscious thought, I picked up a piece. I didn't cook it. I just started tearing into the cold, slimy flesh with my teeth. The guest was hungry, and it didn't care about my stomach. The taste was iron-rich and raw, a saltiness that coated my tongue and throat. As I chewed, I started speaking again. The words were wet, muffled by the raw meat, but they felt powerful. They felt like they were vibrating through the floorboards. That's when I saw the first shadow. It wasn't in the room with me, but it was in the reflection of the oven door. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that looked like gnarled branches. It wasn't standing behind me, it was standing inside the space where my shadow should have been. I realized then that the guest wasn't just a voice. It was a tenant, and it was starting to move the furniture around. I tried to fight it. I tried to scream, to reclaim my own throat, but the more I struggled, the more the guest pushed back. It felt like a freezing wave of liquid nitrogen pouring down my spine. My muscles locked up, and I fell to the kitchen floor. I lay there, staring at the underside of the cabinets, watching the dust bunnies dance in the draft. My mouth kept moving, whispering secrets about the earth, about the way the soil tastes when it's soaked in the fluids of the dead, about a history of the world that involved things much larger and hungrier than humans. I must have blacked out, because when I came to, it was dark outside. My mouth was coated in a thick, dark crust that didn't smell like copper. It smelled like a stagnant pond, like something that had been rotting in the sun for weeks. My fingernails were torn back, bleeding onto the linoleum, and there were deep gouges in the wooden cabinets where I must have been clawing at them. But the worst part was the trail of dark, viscous fluid leading from the kitchen into the basement. I followed it, my legs shaking, every nerve in my body screaming for me to run out the front door and never look back. But the guest wanted me to see. It wanted me to understand the price of the inheritance. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw what I'd done. I don't even remember getting the neighbor's dog, a friendly golden retriever that used to bark at the mailman. It was pinned to the work table where my dad used to fix lawnmowers. It hadn't been a quick process. The guest likes to take its time with the translations. The animal had been opened up, but not like a butcher would do it. It was opened like a book. The ribs were pulled back and snapped, the organs arranged in a very specific, geometric pattern across the wood. And written on the walls in that same dark, foul-smelling fluid were symbols I'd never seen before, yet I knew exactly what they meant. They were names. Names of things that lived in the dark spaces between the stars, things that the guest was calling home. I'm sitting in my bedroom now, typing this out because I don't know how much longer I'll have control of my hands. The pressure in my head is becoming unbearable. It's not just a headache, it feels like my skull is being stretched from the inside, like my brain is growing too large for the bone. I can hear the guest humming. It's a low, vibrating sound that makes the pictures on my walls tilt. I looked in the mirror again 5 minutes ago. My tongue is different. It's longer, darker, and the tip is split into 2 distinct flickering points. When I breathe out, the air is cold, even though the heater is running at full blast. I can feel my memories slipping away, replaced by images of vast, gray plains under a black sun and cities made of bone that stretch upward into a sky filled with screaming birds. I think about my dad a lot today. I think about why he never talked about his own father, or why he spent so many nights locked in the garage, screaming in a language no one could understand. He wasn't a mechanic because he liked cars. He was a mechanic because he needed the constant noise of engines to drown out the voice in his head. He was trying to outrun the guest, but you can't outrun your own DNA. The guest is flipping the pages faster now. I can feel it reaching for my childhood, for the memory of my mother's face, for the feeling of the sun on my skin. It's erasing them, translating them into its own cold, dead history. My hands are starting to stiffen. My fingers are curling into claws, and the rhythm of those ancient words is starting to beat in time with my heart. If you ever find yourself speaking words you don't know, or if you feel a presence sitting in the back of your mind like a librarian in a tomb, don't go to a doctor. Don't go to a professor. Just get out while you still remember who you are. Because once the guest starts speaking, it never, ever stops until it's finished the story. And the story always ends in red.
Next story.
My sister, Elena, was always the lucky one in the family. She had the perfect job, a husband who actually listened, and eventually, the perfect pregnancy. At least, that's how it looked from the outside. I remember sitting in the darkened ultrasound room during her 24-week scan, the only sound being the rhythmic, mechanical thrum of the heartbeat monitor. The technician was moving the wand over Elena's gel-slicked stomach, and for a while, everything was normal. We saw the spine, the tiny ribs, and the fluttering pulse. Then the wand stalled. The technician tilted the screen, squinting at a dark, blurred shape positioned right behind the fetus. It looked like a cluster of long, thin shadows tangled around the baby's legs. It wasn't a shadow in the way a bone casts one. It looked like something physical was occupying the same cramped space. I saw what looked like 3 distinct joints on a limb that shouldn't have been there, trailing off into the graininess of the image. The doctor came in a few minutes later, took one look, and let out a short, dismissive laugh. He told us it was just an imaging artifact, probably a fluke with the way the waves were bouncing off the uterine wall or a pocket of fluid. But my grandmother, who had insisted on coming along, didn't laugh. She sat in the corner of the room, her hands folded over her cane, staring at that grainy monitor with eyes that seemed to see right through the digital display. She leaned forward and whispered something that made the hair on my neck stand up. She said the guest was just preparing its luggage. The doctor ignored her, but Alina looked pale for the rest of the day. When Leo was born, he looked like a miracle. He had 10 fingers, 10 toes, and eyes that were a deep, startling blue. For the first few months, we all tried to forget about that ultrasound. We chalked it up to nerves and faulty tech. But as Leo grew, things started to feel off. It wasn't that he was a difficult baby. In fact, he was unnervingly quiet. He would lie in his crib for hours, staring at a specific corner of the ceiling, his eyes tracking something with terrifying precision. He wasn't just looking into space, he was watching a presence. The air in the nursery always felt dense, like you were walking through invisible cobwebs. It was a suffocating sensation that made your lungs work harder just to get a full breath. I stayed over one night to help Alina while her husband was away on business. I was sitting in the rocking chair, feeding Leo a bottle, when I noticed he wasn't looking at me. He was looking over my shoulder. His little face broke into a wide, toothless grin, and he let out a soft, bubbling coo. I turned around, expecting to see a moth or a shadow from the streetlights, but there was nothing but the blank, eggshell white wall. When I looked back at Leo, his hand was reaching out toward the empty air behind me. For a split second, the light from the hallway hit him at just the right angle, and I saw it. A gray, spindly hand, easily 3 times the size of a human's, seemed to manifest directly out of the center of Leo's chest. It didn't have skin like ours. It looked like wet parchment stretched over jagged bone. The fingers were impossibly long, ending in blunt, blackened tips. It reached out and brushed against the rattle I was holding, and I felt a cold, sharp vibration travel up my arm. I dropped the bottle. The plastic hit the floor with a dull thud, milk splashing across the rug. I blinked, and the hand was gone. Leo didn't cry. He didn't even seem startled. He just looked at the empty space where that limb had appeared and whispered a name. It wasn't a baby sound. It was a clear, 3-syllable name, Malachi. My heart felt like it was going to burst through my ribs. That name was on our family tree. I remembered seeing it on a weathered headstone in the old village cemetery back home, a relative from 10 generations ago who supposedly disappeared into the woods and was never found. I tried to tell myself I was hallucinating, that the sleep deprivation was finally catching up to me, but the smell in the room changed. It didn't smell like baby powder or milk anymore. It smelled like the air inside a rusted metal box that had been buried in wet earth for a century, metallic, damp, and ancient. A few weeks later, Alina called me, her voice sounding thin and ragged. She told me she had found bruises on Leo. Not the kind of bruises a baby gets from bumping into things, but long, thin marks that looked like they had been made by powerful, narrow fingers. They were wrapped around his ribs and his upper arms, deep purple welts that didn't seem to hurt him when she touched them. She said she had caught him playing in his playpen, but he wasn't playing with his blocks. He was suspended 3 inches off the floor, his little legs kicking in the air as if something was holding him up by his armpits. I went over there immediately. When I walked into the house, the atmosphere was oppressive. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath. We sat in the kitchen, and Alina showed me a video she'd taken on the baby monitor. It was grainy and night vision green, but the details were unmistakable. Leo was lying in his crib, fast asleep. Then, a mass of shadows began to unfurl from beneath him. It looked like a tangle of dark, oily hair or roots, slowly snaking up over the sides of the mattress. These appendages, I can't call them arms, began to stroke his head. The worst part was when the thing leaned over him. It didn't have a face, just a suggestion of a jaw and two hollow pits where eyes should be. It pressed its head against Leo's chest, and for a moment, they seemed to merge. The baby's skin rippled like water, and you could see the outline of those long, spindly fingers moving just beneath his surface, pushing against his ribs from the inside out. I couldn't look away from the screen. As we watched, Leo's eyes snapped open. He didn't look scared. He looked satisfied. He reached up and touched the void where the creature's face should be. The creature let out a sound that didn't come through the speakers. It was a sound we felt in our teeth, a low-frequency vibration that made my stomach churn. Since then, the transition has become more obvious. Elena tries to cover it up with long-sleeved onesies, but you can see the way Leo moves now. His joints sometimes bend in directions that should snap bone. When he crawls, there is a distinct clicking sound, like drywood snapping, coming from his spine. Sometimes, when he's hungry, he doesn't cry. He just opens his mouth, and you can see a second set of teeth, much smaller and needle-sharp, retreating back into his throat. The smell of the house has become unbearable. It's that same scent of wet, rusted iron and rotting vegetation. It clings to your clothes and stays in the back of your throat for days after you leave. Our grandmother visited one last time before she passed away. She stood over Leo's crib, watched him for a long minute, and then looked at us with a terrifying sort of pity. She told us that the guest wasn't just using him as a bridge anymore. The bridge was being dismantled to build a permanent doorway. Last night, Elena sent me a photo. It was a picture of Leo's nursery door. It was covered in deep, jagged gouges, as if something with iron claws had been trying to get out. But the scratches weren't on the outside. They were on the inside. She said she hears him talking in the middle of the night, but it isn't one voice. It's a chorus of voices, overlapping and whispering in languages that sound like the scraping of stones. I don't go over there anymore. I can't. Every time I see a shadow on a wall or hear a floorboard creak, I think of that ultrasound. I think of those extra limbs tangled around a heartbeat. I know that the boy in that house isn't my nephew. He's just the shell for something that has been waiting for 10 generations to come back, and it's almost finished unpacking its bags. The most horrible part isn't that the monster is in the house. It's that the monster is wearing the face of a child, and it's learning how to walk.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.